It's a delight to welcome you all here this evening. We're particularly delighted to have Aisha and Partha Dasgupta here to talk about this set of questions. Partha is an economist. Aisha is not an economist, although questions about whether anybody could not be an economist. Many economists think that we're the general case. I fear we're wrong. So Aisha is an expert in fertility, family planning, did her doctorate at the London School. Partha is an economist. They are father and daughter, and that seems strangely appropriate given the subject of this evening's discussion. What we thought so the three of us will have a conversation for the next half an hour or so, and then we'll open it out to questions and discussion with all of you. But if any of you feels a really burning desire to get in while the three of us are talking, please, make that known, and we'll see if we can make that happen too. We thought the sensible thing was to allow both Partha and Aisha to make some opening remarks. I'm going to give them 5 minutes or so in a moment to help us to understand why this question, and how did you, with your different disciplinary backgrounds and perspectives, come to this, and maybe why don't we talk about this particular set of questions? How many people can earth support and comfort? Why isn't it more discussed than it is? So where from, why, and we've discussed who would go first, and Partha has drawn the going first question. So Partha.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let's say why it's not discussed very much is not something I can really respond to. Of course, I can comment on it in the sense of I think it's rather bad form not to do so. But how did I get involved in it? It's first of all, it is a very beautiful question to ask. So I think the aesthetics of the social sciences is something that we don't brag about. Physicists always do, mathematicians do, but we think we are here to do good. But I kind of downplay that part. It's a very beautiful question because it's connected to the issues of our relationship with the biosphere, and the human nature interaction is something, to me, is about as poetic a field of thought as it can be. So I've been interested in problems of population and resources since my graduate student days back in the second half of the 60s. My first published paper was on the concept of optimum population, so it goes back there. At my age, one thing, many of you are very young, you won't know this yet, but eventually you will be asking yourself to sort of sum up. It sort of comes very naturally, sum up of why you've been wasting your time in whatever you've been wasting your time on. And it's easy to outthink the question because ex post rationalization is possible. But I'm going to try that in the next 3-4 minutes with you as to why I came to this question and why I think Aisha must have, she can say as to how she got involved in it, but this period but my lifetime has been a very interesting lifetime for the average person on Earth. I'm going to talk about exclusively on the average person on Earth. Okay, I'm not talking about income inequality, wealth inequalities. We discussed that a lot. I'm talking now about the globe as a whole and the average person. The reason my period, my life, has been a very interesting period is something like that goes as follows. In 1950, and you'll see in a minute why I'm picking that year, life expectancy, the average person at birth, was 45 years. And now it's a little over 71 years. Per capita income at today's prices, international dollars, was about $3,000 a year. Today it's 15,000. Total population of the world at that time was about 2.5 billion. Today it's 7.4, pushing towards 7.5 billion. Literacy rate has just swept the field. We've never had it so good. And we read about it every other year. A book comes out showing how we have mastered the earth in some ways, mastered our own fate. We can do it. So it's in some sense the best of times. If God gave you the option of being dropped at random in some period, you choose the period and you'll be dropped at random on Earth, it would be rather silly not to pick now or the last 65 years or so. This would, certainly I would choose it. So that's one side. On the other hand, there is another side which you read about a lot. But let me give you some more precise data. Last year, there was a paper published in Science by some of the world's leading Earth scientists. The head of the Geological Survey of this country was a lead author of it, which tracked 11 biogeochemical signatures, phosphorus deposits, nitrogen deposits, in ice cores over the past 11,000 years, and showed that every one of them the time series has a hockey stick shape that you are familiar with in reading about climate change, carbon concentration, which was one of the signatures, by the way. So, and that the turning point, the massive turning point, was about 1950. So much so that these worthies, the great geoscientists of the universe, have dubbed about 1950 as the year that we ushered in the Anthropocene, the new epoch, they claim, where we are dominating the Earth system. Now, then, of course, there's a plethora of more micro data about the state of the ecosystems in particular. Start with very, very small regions into biomes. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of 2005 reported that 15 of the 24 biomes they had reviewed were either damaged or beyond repair in the sense that it was going to. Now, each of these damages has a hysteresis, so it's not as though you can turn you can just shut off the damage. It's just like a fertility momentum, population momentum. There's a momentum in each of these dynamical systems because these are highly nonlinear. So the past has an imprint on the future. So as you probably know, the climate scientists will tell you that even if the net emissions of carbon today were dropped to zero, the momentum will still carry on. So the imprint of the past. So it seems also to be, in some ways, the worst of times. So the question then, to me, has been that it's a reasonable thing to suppose that we are reasonably intelligent people, and we care about our children. I don't know of any society where parents don't care about their children. They do. And being an economist, of course, I say to myself, if I care about my children, and in other words, I care about their well-being, I know if I'm intelligent that they'll care about the well-being of their children. And so by recursion, I care about my grandchildren's well-being. And then by recursion, I care about my great-grandchildren's well-being, and so forth indefinitely. So I can't be faulted for not caring about next generation. But being an economist, of course, I say, I care about my dynasty. You care about your dynasty. Perhaps I don't care so much about your dynasty, and you don't care that much about my dynasty. And there is a well-known understanding that many of these issues, interactions, don't have are shot with externalities, by which I mean unintended consequences, or more accurately, unaccounted consequences, unaccounted for consequences of our actions. So a great deal of my work has been trying to see whether the best of times and the worst of times, the two together, could be put into a common intellectual framework for us to understand how it could be that we are so well off now. We've done so well in so many ways. But could we have done it? Are we doing it at the expense of the future in running down natural capital of the biosphere? And so that's why I asked the question, because it's the impact of our activities on the Earth system or the biosphere, which is being measured, monitored by the Earth scientists, and the problems that we have created. And that impact depends both on numbers as well as the average impact. It's just a product of the two, given institutions, given technology, and so forth. And we'll come back to that later if there are any questions about it. So at least one piece of it is numbers. And since most of my colleagues don't work on, think that population is not part of economics, I've always felt it was a good thing to think about, quite apart from the fact it's a very beautiful subject. Okay.
Thank you. Partha, thank you very much, and we'll come back to some of those things in a moment. But Aisha, you came at these things, I'm sure there was table talk throughout your life that had economics in it, but you came at these things not from an economic perspective. So how did you get here?
Well, I should say that I now work at the United Nations Population Division, but I'm actually currently on leave from the Population Division because I've just had a baby. So my participation today, which I'm really thrilled to be a part of this event, my participation today is just in my own capacity, and I'm not representing the UN or the views of the UN today. So to me, I came across this sort of seeming contradiction. On the one hand, I'm hearing from environmental scientists, my dad, environmental economists, and so on, about the negative environmental externalities associated with people and the impact that we're having on our environment and what that impact means for others. So the externalities associated with additional births. But then on the other hand, through my work I'm a demographer, and I've worked in reproductive health. In this community, we're very careful to talk about and to respect the reproductive rights of individuals. So that is to respect the rights of women and couples to choose whether to have children, when to have children, how many, and so on. And there's very good reason for respecting those rights. Family planning has had a difficult history. There have been some very ugly examples of coercion, particularly coerced sterilizations in the past. And the community has really dedicated themselves to never letting that happen again. So for example, in the 94 conference in Cairo, the International Conference on Population and Development, the community really committed themselves to this issue. And I just wanted to read a phrase that comes out of the programme of action that's really critical. Reproductive rights rests on the recognition of the basic right of all couples and individuals to decide freely and responsibly the number, spacing and timing of their children, and to have the information and means to do so, and the right to attain the highest standard of sexual and reproductive health. And this has been echoed again since. So for example, FP 2020, which is a global partnership which was established in 2012. This is a global partnership, again, committed to family planning. They've asserted the fundamental right of individuals to decide freely and for themselves whether, when, and how many children to have. So how do we make sense of this seeming contradiction? On the one hand, recognising the rights of individuals to choose how many children they have, whether that's 0 or 1, 2 or 6, 7, 8. But then on the other hand, recognising the rights of others who may suffer negatively from the impact of those additional births. So does one set of rights trump the interest of all others around them? So that seems to me perhaps a contradiction. We know that family planning brings all manner of benefits to the individuals who use contraceptive methods, and it's been shown to have all sorts of benefits in terms of education, health outcomes, and gender equality and so on. But the paper that my father and I have recently worked on together, we're really trying to point to the fact that family planning programs bring benefits to many others as well, so far beyond the individual who actually uses that contraceptive method. And what we've really been arguing is that family planning programs have been drastically undervalued. And so we've really been trying to point to the value of family planning programs. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Aisha, you talked about the paper that the two of you have been working on together. That has some numbers in it. And my understanding of the numbers is that your current shared view is that the answer to how many people can earth supporting comfort probably is quite a lot fewer than it looks as though we're going to end up with at peak estimated population. Is that right?
Yes, in our paper we took a very rough stab, sort of back of the envelope attempt just to sort of demonstrate the sorts of numbers we're talking about. And in fact, I wonder if now might be a good time to go to the slide that we have. So this figure is simply showing total population, and it's split up by region. And it starts around today, and it's projected forward to the end of the century. So you can see where growth is likely to be. In Africa, we're around 1 billion people are currently living in Africa today, and it's projected to look at closer to 4 billion by the end of the century. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about
to follow the question, Aisha's answer, to elaborate on it a little bit. So remember, I've suggested that suppose we are interested in the impact we have on the biosphere. By impact, I mean the stuff we take out. The biosphere should be seen as a gigantic factory. It's churning out stuff all the time and offering goods and services we are using all the time. I hang out with ecologists a lot, so I tend to think along that term. It's a very, the way they think about biosphere is very similar to how Andrew and I think of economies. It's a really very similar intellectual structure to the production processes. Obviously, the objects that are put out differ, but the processes are very similar in terms of the intellectual core of it. So as a first approximation, you might say, well, how do I know what the impact is? I can see the effect. Obviously, that's what you do when you look at a biome and then see whether it's functioning or not. You look at an estuary and ask whether, in fact, the fisheries have declined. Is it now becoming a dead zone? That sort of thing is pretty straightforward. That's much documented, goes without saying. But the human impact, one way of doing it, as a first approximation, you might say, well, let's see what our human activities are, and the standard coin is GDP, income or output. So you make the connection with that, and what we did was to ask ourselves that obviously how many people can Earth support, that alone is not a good question, because you need to know at what standard of living are we talking about. So you need some kind of you have a trade-off there. The simplest thing would be the trade-off between numbers and standard of living is because it's the product of the two which is mirrored into the impact we have. That's a straightforward, simplest calculation. And we can elaborate on that and modify it and so forth through technological change and you name it, but as a first cut. So the trick was for us to think of how to, instead of saying, well, it depends on what the standard of living is or what comfort means. Well, that sort of gives you a range, but it's not going to give you an infinite range. It's going to still give you a range, but it's not going to be one number. And we thought what we would do is to use, since there is nobody else doing this kind of work, I felt we could, and both of us felt we could be very brazen. You start becoming cautious once the subject settles down. If you're starting it, boy, you can go to town on that, right? Because if somebody says, why are you choosing this number? It sounds I can say, well, you tell me a better one, and I'll do the calculation for you. So what we did was to look at there's a large, very interesting literature, applied literature on happiness. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's now becoming quite prominent in the philosophical literature, in the moral philosophy literature, because you're getting your teeth into the question of what makes people, their well-being, what contributes to them. And it's not been very, very surprising, by the way. Employment matters. Marriage is a good thing. Having children is nice. From these questionnaires. Now, one of the set of time series suggested, at least in a book that Lord Layard produced on happiness some years ago, a few years ago, that they found that that particular study showed that approximately incomes above about 20,000 international dollars at 2015 prices was not statistically correlated with increased happiness. So we just chose that in our paper as an example. You can choose something else. Remember, per capita income is now about 15,000, so we're above that. And we then made use of some work that's been done by the global eco system. Sorry?
The global footprint.
Global footprint network. What they have been doing for a long while with the network of collaborators, trying to estimate the, if you like, the annual demand we make on the biosphere relative to the supply that it can manage. So we have to think of the biosphere as a renewable resource, like a forest, a pond, a lake, fisheries. And if you take more out than it can produce, then of course you're diminishing the stock. So that's the model on the basis of which these calculations are done. And so we used their estimate of the overshoot of demand to supply, and then used the 20,000 to come up with a figure. Just as an illustration, and that is answer to Andrew's question, and we found that it will be about 3.5 billion, which is of course far less than what it is now, less than half. As I say, it's a complete, it's a way to concentrate attention on the question. It's not an answer to the question.
Which is also a population, it was the world population in the 60s or so. So it's not,
yes, yeah,
it's not too long ago that we were at that population. And of course, if we were to suppose that we would be content with an average income of $10,000, half of the 20,000 figure that we, playing around with the numbers here, well then we would end up with a figure of 7 billion, which is pretty much where we are today, more or less.
And the striking thing about the picture, which we can see in front of us and you can see behind you, is, Africa is the striking thing, isn't it? That Europe, and it doesn't really count in numbers, although of course we have a much higher level of consumption than much of the rest of the world. And so, so if we were looking at impact on the biosphere, Europe would look much bigger than Finland. But the worrying thing is what's happening to African population. That's the thing that takes us further away from. And as a population demographer, one of the puzzles for most of us seems to be that in Africa fertility rates are not dropping as quickly as they have in Asia. Yeah. What do you think is going on there? And if we were to value family planning programs more highly, could we have an impact?
So today, the total fertility rate in Sub-Saharan Africa today is still around 5. So meaning women are having, on average, around 5 children over the course of their lifetime, which is much higher than other regions in the world, Asia, Latin America went through their demographic transitions some decades ago now. And it's really those high fertility rates and then, of course, population momentum that is contributing to that growth that we see there. Family planning programs clearly, are extremely important and are going to be terribly important in the coming years to serve those couples, those women who don't want to get pregnant and either don't currently have access to contraception, either because of location issues, financial issues, social barriers or whatever. But one of the other things that we've written about in our paper is the contribution of conformity. And so what we mean by that is, well, we're all social animals. And so, one woman's preferences over her family size, are likely to be influenced in large part by attention to others in her community and what her peers and, other families in her community are doing. And so it could be that there may have been a reason in some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa for having high fertility rates in the past. But perhaps those reasons have now gone, or that it's changed, but nevertheless those practices persist. And so a community could get embedded in a practice of having large numbers of children, even though the rationale for that may no longer be the case. So we've written to some extent about the role of conformity and how to shift that.
It has a very general point. So this is another area where economists have been very slow to take the instructions from anthropologists and sociologists. So for anthropologists, this is no big news. They're puzzled to the extent to which we economists model humans as egoists. That, we have preferences which are independent of what others are doing. There's tons of work. I mean, literally thousands of pages of empirical work suggesting how we are influenced by the others. Now, in this case, these norms can be very sticky, and it's possible to study these things analytically, not just empirically, and then the two seem to mesh very well, the stickiness of norms. And if there are other factors in operation as well, this is an area which is really, it's cross-culturally very interesting. What we see as a particular cultural norm in another society, which may have strong functional purpose behind it, because capital markets don't exist, or even standard commodity markets don't exist. A great deal of the exchanges may be through norm-based reciprocity. And they can be sticky. And if they retain their flavor, you can have, again, the echo of the past working to consolidate things.
And do we have any sense of whether family planning programs might be the best way of nudging the conformity, or whether there's something else? And also, again, a question to both of you, do we have any hypotheses about why that kind of stickiness of conformity seems to have been broken down in Asia, large parts of the Middle East and Europe, but might be stickier in Africa and possibly at some other parts of Asia? Do we have a sense on either of those?
I can give one part, and then I'll pass it on to Aisha for the specific issues regarding Africa. One thing that comes up with it is to, in some sense, nudge the family planning programs to make them more collective. That is to say, at a center, to have a group of women from the same region, the same village, participating in it, where they converse with one another, so that their choices become more informed. But informed not about the merits of contraception, I don't mean that. Informed about the intentions of the others. So take a question of the following sort. How many children, you ask somebody age 20, how many children would you ideally like to have? Now the answer, if that question is asked, the answer to that question is likely to be different from the following answer to the following question. How many children would you like to have if all your neighbors had 2? How many children would you like to have if all your neighbors had 3? So you ask a string of such questions, and it's very unlikely that the answer is going to be independent of the conditioned on what others do. So that's one area where I think family planning programs could successfully, and it has been in Bangladesh, the family planning programs did involve, some parts of it certainly, collective engagement, group engagements, came through also from the lending side of things, if you remember. So I think there is scope for that. Aisha, you might want to talk about some of the additional features of African society, like adoption.
Well, I was also going to add the Jensen and Oster study. There was the experimental study which looked at the changes in fertility rates in Indian states, and I think it was those states which had cable TV first went through a demographic transition earlier, and so the idea is those who were exposed to cable TV, had a broader sort of reference community. And that, that could have been a trigger. So I think, the role of media and newspapers and internet and so on, I think can be very powerful, and is something that a good family planning program ought to be, thinking of those sorts of mechanisms.
And is it right to say that at one level, in thinking that we'd like more family planning programs? And I'm aware that language here is very clumsy, so we're almost saying that we think by adding further information we can help change people's preferences to be more consistent with their own long-run happiness and well-being, whereas part of what the rest of the argument is much more about externalities that we're trying to get individuals to...
Well, okay. I'm an economic theorist, and there's a slight element of pedantry amongst theorists. So, I wouldn't say the way fastidiousness is the right word. Exactly, that's very nice. I prefer that. I wouldn't say it's changing your preferences. It's not the way you present. These questionnaires are picking up a part of the answer to the question that it's not preferences are not changed. It's that the domain on which my preferences operate is much larger than the domain that the investigator thinks it operates on. And so therefore, there are externalities here also. So these are not cultural externalities. They are externalities coming through the fact that other people's activities are influencing my choice. Not my preference, but my choice. I observe the behavior of others, and that influences my best practice. And so there is the externalities we are looking at in our paper and in this conversation we are having are not only environmental externalities, but in this case, reproductive externalities. And when you come to that, there is a common ground in that over consumption externalities. One of the things that Laird was pointing to in his the $20,000 example the $20,000 example that I talked about was the Veblen point that we look around to see what others are doing, and we feel less happy if our income or status is lower than others. So there is an element of the rat race that emerges out of that. Now, it can operate in various spheres of life, but the most common one that's been studied is consumption. So there's externalities at each of these levels, and our paper really was, at least what we have been trying to do in our work, is to put them together into a coherent whole, to see, to try and explain this phenomenal phenomenon, as this diagram this shows, because it's worrying. It's worrying because Sub-Saharan African per capita income is about $3,000 today, and population is 1 billion. And it's very reasonable, absolutely essential, that the Africans have a better life. If you just keeping everything frozen, increasing the per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa to 15,000, which is the world average now, will be a 5-time increase. But there will be a four-fold increase in population. So you have a factor of 20 increase. So, so we are looking at a massive impact on the continent itself. And so in some ways, the worry about sub-Saharan Africa, since you pointed that out, is really about them, their future, their children, as to what and in some ways the Sustainable Development Goals have been perhaps, I mean, they're extremely laudable, they're noble goals, no question about it. But I don't think they thought through the interconnection of the goals, so that the question of whether the goals are actually reachable on a reasonably sustainable basis is something that can be, one should worry about. And one of the messages of our paper is that somehow the figures don't add up quite as easily as you might think.
Can I ask a question? Isn't there the danger that we are disguising the actual problem by putting fertility above consumption patterns around the world and around the disparity between the ones who have a lot and the ones who have very little? And we are basically in the countries where we think that we are safe because fertility is low. We are actually not confronting the issue, which is consumption and lack of equal consumption, of equality in the society. Isn't that the danger that we are actually not looking, we're looking at fertility as the issue, but the actual issue is another one, which is more related to the current financial systems that we have, the current consumption patterns that we have.
It's a very, very good question indeed, and let me, if I may, it's excellent question, and I can say that because we haven't overlooked it in our paper, so I'll tell you why. So remember, I did talk about the average times the numbers, average impact of the numbers, and you're pointing to the fact that, of course, there's a huge inequality. We have an estimate of the following sort. Suppose the rich world, the OECD countries, average income dropped from, the rich world's average income today is about 41,000 international dollars, okay? If that dropped to the 20,000, just for the sake of argument, then the total impact, even as we sit, will come close to the impact which is currently sustainable. So you're absolutely right. The choice is there too. The reason we are concentrating here, the question was asked about the fertility side, is simply because there's going to be a disproportionate problem that Africans will face in the future. But 11 billion, the per capita income at which with current institutions and technologies can support an average lifestyle would be much lower than the 15,000 today. So when you say, isn't the real problem consumption, not fertility, there I think I slightly depart from you. The real problem is about the total impact that we might have on the biosphere and its biosphere's capability of responding in a healthy way. And how that impact is apportioned between numbers and standard of living and across regions, spatial distribution of standard of livings and numbers. That, of course, is a gigantic problem for us all to think about. So I wouldn't say the real problem lies here, not there. The real problem lies in this mesh of issues connected with distribution, current distribution, intergenerational distribution, consumption, or impact per person in a region, and numbers.
So let's talk very briefly, and then we really will throw it right, about what we can do. Aisha, can we plausibly imagine getting population down to the kinds of levels that the two of you are talking about? You know, is it feasible that we can get fertility down by enough to make that difference? And Partha, you know, if abstracting now from the fertility question, how much of the solution is about technological change, and how much of that is about getting prices into things that are currently unpriced? But let's start with fertility.
There was some work that estimated that if all unmet need and when I say unmet need, sorry, this is an indicator that is used to track the progress and the success of family planning programs. So it's the proportion of women who have an unmet need for family planning. So these are women who don't want to have another child or don't want to have a child and are not currently using contraception. So there was some work that estimated if all unmet need in Africa was eliminated by the provision of contraception, there would be a billion fewer people by the end of the century. So clearly, family planning programs is a great place to start, and it's really great that in the last few years, family planning has been getting a bit more back on the agenda. It had been woefully neglected for some decades, really, and there is now more attention and some more funding coming to family planning. Still a lot of work to be done, and still a lot more funding is required for family planning, but that's certainly a great place to start. And there's also been work to show the sort of bootstrap as more women use contraception, and it becomes more common and accepted, and my sister's now using it. More and more women want to use contraception. So that's my
so we could make a big. We could get the 11.4 billion down to maybe 10. That's still 3 times as many as you think is. So what progress can we make with pricing and technology to go further?
Part of it, I should say, one of the things I've avoided all my life is public policy, because there are greater minds working on public policy. Partly also because, to be more serious about the matter, is that in the areas that are being covered by this conversation, public policy will be very, very location specific. I don't mean culture specific only, I mean location specific. What works in a river valley is very different from what works in the mountains, and so forth. So ecology matters hugely. One of the great contributions of anthropology has been to show how ecology matters for the economy. So I couldn't talk about public policy per se, but these numbers do is to offer pointers. And one of the pointers is what the gentleman has just asked. Something has to be done about consumption of the rich. And when I say something has to be done, that's more standard economics, by the way. So if an economist is told of consumption externalities in a market framework, you will say, well, there should be consumption taxes. It's a standard sort of, it's not a... but there's no question that is something that we need to grapple with. If you take the interaction with the biosphere seriously, of course you can dismiss it by saying, well, who cares? But then, of course, you would come back to say, well, maybe our grandchildren will care. And it's the earth that we pass on to our great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, which is, after all, the start of the conversation. So you can't sort of jump out of it. So I think there's a good deal to be done on that side. We're resistant to it because, in a way, our culture, the economic culture, and economics has been so powerful in convincing ourselves of our own well-being. It's a very strange thing that a discipline could influence our own conception of our own well-being. Our standard will be, who are you to tell me what I should consume? It's my fundamental right. And the more I have, I will be better off. Some years ago, the Guardian published an article in which a gentleman in Stamford, Connecticut, apparently one of the richest towns in the United States, was remarked, I may be in the top 1% of the US economy, but where I stand, I feel I'm the bottom third of those around me. And that was very telling because his perception, our perception of how well off we are does depend on what our neighbors are like and what they have. If you recognize that, you're staring at another externality, and there is a case for taxation without us being that badly hurt. That's the key thing. Okay. So there is room for that. But now Andrew has also asked about technological change. And absolutely right. We must look at that to say that maybe we could bypass some of the problems with the biosphere by being smart, by discovering ways of life which do not have that much of an impact. And that's for sure, we might be able to do that. But bear in mind one thing, the incentives entrepreneurs have for innovation are on the whole guided by prices. And no sensible entrepreneur is going to economize on cheap factors of production. It'll be expensive factors of production he will wish to economize, say labor maybe. Biosphere, not so much because it's free. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. So the direction, the biases in technological change of the past 200 years is absolutely marked. Every one of them has helped humanity, for sure. The bulldozer, the chainsaw, modern fishing equipment, they have made life so much easier for us. But the problem is they lead to externalities of a huge amount because you can then carve a whole forest without any problem. I think, finally, I think it's more institutions that require fixing. Our recognition that our activities are embedded in a mesh of externalities or give rise to externalities. That recognition requires institutional changes. I think climate change, the concentration on climate change as being the sole or near sole environmental problem of modern times has directed us towards looking for technological fixes. Because the natural thing to do is if we are spilling so much of carbon, why not find ways to unspill it? The problem with ecosystem services, species preservation, is that that's a technological issue. It's really to do with institutions, how we manage our life. When do we say, thus far, no farther, that piece of land is not to be touched, or that part of the ocean is not to be fished? That is not technological, that's institutional. So I think my own feeling now is that if we think of some of the biggest problems the globe faces, carbon is one, climate change is one, and that's the one which we mostly read about. But species extinction is another. It's a big, big thing looming in the horizon. The oceans themselves, they require, it seems to me, a good deal of attention in terms of institutional reforms. And by institutions, I really now mean international, collective concern about it. And then it has to filter down, obviously, the local level for regional or location-specific policies. So it's not so much policy, it's a recognition of where the problems lie and why, how they occur. After that, I retire, so to speak.
Okay, now let's throw it open. It'd be really helpful if you could say, give us your name and roughly what you study or are interested in. And I think we might take two or three. Lady here, and a gentleman there. So we'll take those three for now, and I will come back to you later.
Hi, my name is Liana, and I'm studying Master of Public Policy. So it was very, yeah. Anyway, my question is, with this figure, is there a breakdown as to the age of expected? Because what we're seeing now is we're heading towards an aging population. Whether is that trend going to sustain, where we will have more older people versus young people? And I would like to also signpost the fact that more people are living with chronic diseases nowadays. In your opinion, do you think it's worth spending money to improve, say, cancer research, to let people live longer, but reduce the quality of life? Or is it better to push that money towards climate change?
Very good. And then, please, thank you.
Is that on? Yes, sorry. I'm Bronwyn. I'm a visiting fellow. I serve on the IPCC at the moment, but I should say this is just my personal question. I would just like to push you a little bit on the comments that the gentleman at the front made. Thomas Piketty and Kevin Anderson's argument is that if we take the top 10% of consumers who are producing about 45% of net emissions at the moment, if we just got them down to the average lifestyle of a European, we would cut our net carbon budget by 33% immediately. So in that context, is there a moral question for particularly the UK and the US, but other high consumption individuals? And I just wonder, we've had a lot of public discussion about this is an odd question, but about the trend, particularly in England at the moment, for richer celebrities and wealthy people to have larger families again. So these are, if you're thinking of social norms, these are big personal questions as well. But I just want to say how lovely it was to hear a father-daughter combination.
Yes, Sudhir Ramamurthy, Research Fellow, Mutuality in Business here at the Business School, and I was also a Manmohan Singh Scholar at St. John's, Cambridge. My question was about, cycling back to your title, about comfort. Do you see a distinction between comfort of the 11 billion people versus comfort of the other species which are perhaps going extinct? In the case that, what if the carrying capacity of the planet doesn't operate like a factory? Thanks.
Who wants to go first? Go, Aisha.
I'll just say very quickly, and then I'll pass over to my dad. The UN Population Division does break down population projections by age group. So yes, that data is available. And yes, there's certainly ageing in Europe and in parts of Asia. And the age structure certainly will be changing in other parts of the world as well. But our focus hasn't actually been on the age structure, more the numbers as you've seen in the previous figure.
Each one of these, I don't think I've done any harm to any of you, so why are you asking me such awfully hard questions? It'll be anything I say is going to be deeply unsatisfactory because of my limitations of my own understanding. You've raised some additional deep moral questions, and this is not an occasion for just simply giving one's gut reaction. It's for us to recognize. Keeping people, actually I've just completed a essay in honor of Kenneth Arrow called on Birth and Death, where I think we do have a very inbuilt and justifiably very desire to preserve life. We are selected to have that, and we approve of it. We all do. So this is not at variance to that. Potential lives is what we are talking about as opposed to actual lives. Now, it is true that at least if you read The Economist, you worry about aging population, who's going to feed the old, and so forth. Well, if we're so settled on technological progress, why are we so necessarily worried about that? And that's one area. And the other is, of course, migration might help that. Younger people from elsewhere. Who knows? It's not for one person or even a group of persons to suggest avenues out of the dilemmas that you're raising. I keep on repeating, I do not have an answer to any of these policy questions. It's recognizing that these are the choices that we probably have to have. Inequality, existing inequality, and in fact, the question that you asked, is absolutely correct to raise it. I hinted at it in my suggestion that if you were to reduce the consumption if people were to reduce their consumption in the OECD countries by half, It will still be well above the average. And if you take the Veblenesque argument that I was giving, maybe not very painful. Actually, I said to myself, I was around in the early 1970s, and per capita income was half of what it is today in England. All right? I didn't see the average British English person unhappier then than he is now or she is now. We get used to it, and we look around, and I think the fact of shared prosperity, shared tragedy, shared whatever, makes life so much easier. So I think there's a great deal that can be done on that. How? I haven't the faintest idea. I can only point to the fact that the pain would be far less than I think people think it would be, for the reasons that we've already gone through. All right? If I understand it, your question had to do, I was using an economist term for a very good reason. It's easy, even if you are not to give any particular value to species per se, there's a great deal that can be done, a great deal of mileage to be had, if you concentrate on the services that humanity enjoys, we as humans do. And then, if it turns out that our thoughts on that are not consistent with preservation of species, that's when you bring the other argument out. It's a research strategy, it's a thinking strategy. Before you start talking morality about life forms or bacteria and so forth, why not ask what they do to us, since our daily life is influenced by our interests? So that's the tactics I'm following. It's useful to have very biased results, by the way. It's as a suggestion to young people. So you've undervalued species because the only thing you care about is what they do for us. Now suppose that tells us that we ought to preserve them. Then of course you get double bang for your buck, because preserving them is also giving the other side of the coin, which is the desire. So it's good to, biased research is not a bad thing if they're cutting through a haze of mush out there. Okay.
One more round of questions. Lady here, a gentleman here, and a lady here. So we'll take these three, and then I think the others will have to wait for drinks. I'm sorry, but neither Partha nor Aisha is going away.
Hi, thank you. I'm also a student at the Master of Public Policy program, and my question is about the part about information for making the decision for fertility, because at the very beginning we talk about people or women in particular should have the information to make the choice. But I was thinking that then what is the relevant information? Like we were talking about consumption and fertility. So on the consumption side, we are actually having more information about how our consumption is affecting the environment, like the fast fashion or the plastic bottle, such that some institutions are actually banning the sales of small plastic bottled water. But how about fertility? So is the impact of having so many people on the environment a relevant information? So I was imagining maybe in future in family planning, in addition to talking about having babies impact on the mother's health or on the family's economic or their children's education, etc., should we add in the leaflet that we already have too many people, the habitats for animals are being affected by you having one more baby, and is it considered to be a relevant information and drawing the analogy that we are now told that our consumption pattern is actually affecting the environment? Why not we are told that our family planning decisions is actually also having quite an impact on the environment? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sarthak and I'm an MPhil student in economics at the university. My question relates to your emphasis on explaining fertility rates on the fact that human beings tend to kind of compare themselves with the others, and that forms a benchmark and dictates their fertility choice to a great extent. But to offer an alternate perspective on this, which mainly comes from the development economics literature, and especially we're dealing with lots of developing countries over here, that it might just be the individualistic decision of a human being to have more kids because of a missing market for old age insurance. So the point over here is that you have 5 kids because A, you don't know how many of them will survive because of very high mortality rates, which is true for the countries mentioned over here. And secondly, you don't know how many will have jobs and will be able to pay for you when you get old. So just spreading more information, having cable TV won't obviate those factors necessarily. Thank you.
Thank you. And one last question.
Nadine Agabatla, staff at United Nations University and senior researcher on water, energy, food nexus. So I wanted to sort of go a little off the tangent and just put a couple of comments and not necessarily questions. The anthropocentric construct of economic theories around sustainability is the compromise that we all have to live with, and that's fair enough. Point 2 is when we talk about the entry points to determine sustainability or to say how many people on Earth can support in comfort, I'm wearing the SDG and the sustainability lens. Are we not putting a number of entry points for international community, development community, and the member states of the United Nations to look into comfort, sustainability, well-being, good quality of life? Do you see a sync on these entry points when we talk about the long-term future trajectories of the sustainability of Earth and the human development?
Thank you. Aisha, you've been back out in Malawi recently, having where some of these conversations could happen. So
I should say that what I was talking about at the beginning in terms of information about family planning, really, I really was talking about very basic, what methods are there available? How might I access them? Do I need to go to a clinic that's static? Is there a community-based health worker who might be able to come to my local community area or even to my home to provide me those methods? So just very basic information. There are some PHE projects, population health and environment projects that are trying to sort of integrate family planning and environmental issues together. But I don't, and some of them are very successful and really doing some great work. But I will just give an example of a billboard that I once saw in a country in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it was a massive billboard, and on the one side of it, it was promoting a particular contraceptive method. And on the other side, there was a picture of deforestation. And I could understand the point that this billboard was trying to make, and it was trying to draw the link. But my view was that it was terribly abstract, and the people that this billboard was supposed to be communicating to, and whatever that message was supposed to be, I guess what I'm trying to say is that how that message is put together, I think, needs careful consideration. And certainly, I think this particular billboard wasn't really working.
Yeah, well, I think you're quite right. I totally agree with you. I think one way to think about it is these recognition. A common recognition of problems is the start. It's not the end. Okay, and it's not the end for the reason that even if you recognize there is a problem, there is a need for the arrangement for collective action. And by collective action, I mean an agreement as to what kind of policies that are required in the specific place. The village, maybe. Start with the village, even. Is a big leap. And that's a leap that I can't make. None of us around this room can make, because it'll be very, very spatially, locally specific. But I don't believe that simply saying that, oh, we're running the earth to ground is going to affect an individual's decision, because an individual has every right to say, well, I'm nothing. I'm not responsible. Who am I? I'm 1 divided by 7.4 billion. And that's nearly 0. It's a very reasonable answer. So we are talking really about the need for collective action, and at every level. At the highest level was, I suppose, the UN SDGs, and coming to the question that you raised, the SDGs. That recognized some key deficiencies in the Earth system, I mean, of the human system, and trying to ameliorate them, and hence the goals. What I think was missing in it, and I want to come back to that point, was a recognition of the interrelationships that we are discussing here this evening. I didn't see that in the documents that led to the SDGs. Now, SDGs are at the highest level, obviously. That's the biggest level of aggregation, requiring international cooperation, that's for sure. How that filters down to specific national policies and then state policies, and at the end of the day, village policies, is an enormous set of tasks before us. But none of this will happen until it happens at the top. But at the same time, it won't happen unless it also simultaneously happens at the bottom. A recognition that perhaps, and we see it in this country, very often people worry about their own consumption levels, voluntary acts of abstinence from consumption patterns of one kind or the other. But these gestures are very, very important, significant, and extremely noble. But we are looking at an order of magnitude much higher that we need. Social preference and lack of markets, and you asked about them, that's absolutely right. And I think when Aisha was talking about the fact that for historical reasons, you may have to target larger families, they can be sticky. And one of the historical reasons is exactly that. There is no capital markets, and there are no even producer capital. So you don't have electricity by turning on a flick of the switch. You don't get water by turning on the tap. The amount of time and energy required per day to get water and fuel in an African village and in the Indian villages too, even now, is quite substantial. So there is a drive for larger families, that's for sure. And then many other things besides that lead to them. And one of the things that we've learned from anthropologists is a heightened understanding of the local conditions in the past which have led to fertility behavior, consumption behavior, behavior across people, obligations that households have with one another, kinship structure, and so forth. These are very, very beautiful areas to think about and subjects to think about. But they can be very sticky. So even if the circumstances change, the behavior may persist. And that's the point that we were discussing earlier about social preferences, that may need coordinated action, coordinated engagement. I may have missed something, but that's for the moment, I think.
We should stop. I've done a terrible thing. I've allowed this to eat into drinks. And I'm not quite sure where they are. That will be directed, I'm sure. I just want to thank both Aisha and Partha. It's been really rather inspiring. It's inspiring. It's lovely to see daughter and father interacting in this way and having worked together. It's lovely to see more than one discipline brought together to try to tackle a question that feels like a very big question that can easily be lost in our disciplinary silos. And I would exhort you, if you haven't already, to go away and read this paper. It's a great paper. It's quite thin. It's quite thin, but it's only thin physically. In every other way, it's thick. Aisha, Partha, thank you very much indeed.